There are two NAT modes based on deployment scenarios: centralized NAT and distributed NAT. In centralized NAT mode, an independent device is attached to a CR, SR, or BRAS to provide the NAT function. In distributed NAT mode, service boards with the NAT function are directly inserted into other devices, such as BRAS, to implement the NAT function. For details about the two modes, see what are the common NAT scenarios on a NetEngine series router. For details about how to configure centralized NAT, see how do I configure centralized NAT on a NetEngine series router. In this video, we will learn how to configure distributed NAT. On the network shown in the figure, a NAT service board is directly installed on a BRAS. A user accesses the BRAS through a CPE, accesses the network through PPPoE authentication. The BRAS performs authentication, authorization, and accounting for the user, and translates the user's private address into a public address so that the user can access the internet. The configuration process is as follows. First, configure basic NAT functions. Second, configure user information and perform authentication. Third, configure a NAT traffic diversion policy. Fourth, configure a NAT conversion policy. Fifth, configure a user-side interface. Step 1. Configure basic NAT functions. First, enable the dedicated board mode, configure session and bandwidth resources for the service board, and adjust the bandwidth and session resources of the NAT service. Distributed NAT supports only dedicated boards. You do not need to manually enable the dedicated board mode for devices on which it is enabled by default. Then, create a NAT instance named NAT1, and bind it to a service board. Finally, configure a NAT address pool, and set the public addresses that can be allocated to 11.11.11.101 to 11.11.11.105. Step 2. Configure user information and perform authentication. First, create an address pool named Pool1 for user access. Then, configure a Radius server to implement authentication and accounting for access users. Next, set the user authentication and accounting modes to Radius, and apply the configured authentication and accounting schemes to the domain. Finally, create a user group named Group1, and bind it to the NAT instance in the domain, so that the device can identify the traffic of Group 1 and perform NAT. Step 3. Configure a NAT traffic diversion policy. First, configure a user ACL rule to allow only the traffic group Group 1 to access the internet. Then, configure a traffic classifier and define an ACL-based matching rule. Next, configure a traffic behavior bound to the NAT instance and a traffic policy that associates the ACL rule with the traffic behavior. Finally, apply the configured traffic policy globally. Step 4. Configure a NAT conversion policy. First, configure ACL 3001 to match the traffic of user group Group 1. Then, bind ACL 3001 to the NAT address pool in the NAT instance, so that the private address in the user packet can be translated into a public address in the NAT address pool. Step 5. Configure interface information. First, configure AVT to allow users to go online in PPPoE access mode. Then, configure a user-side VLAN and bind a sub-interface to the VT interface. Finally, configure a base interface for user access. After the preceding configurations are complete, run the command to check NAT user information. The command output shows that the CPE IP address is in the address pool for user access, and the NAT instance is NAT1, the public IP address is in the NAT address pool. This indicates that the configuration is successful. The private address in the user packet can be translated into a public address so that the user can access the internet. That's all for this video about how to configure distributed NAT on a NetEngine series router. Thank you for watching.